was talking to someone about it yesterday. Oh wow, I just get it all, I guess. There's a couple things. So like Wizards wants commander cards to be relevant to constructed to some degree. All right, so they understand that they're legacy legal, and so they're going to put a couple of cards in each set that realistically can see play. The Broadside Bombardiers is the most recent one. You can realistically see play in Commander. Initiative cards, on just Ravager to a lesser degree. You know, there's usually one a year, two or three a year. And it's really not that many, maybe one a set. So in that case, there's like four a year. So in order for a card to be playable in Legacy, it has to make it past the ultimate gatekeepers of Force of Will, Days, and Wasteland, which means it's probably going to be 3 mana because it can't really afford to be any more expensive than that. You can have hypothetical openings with Lotus Petal or Simian Spirit Guide and Ancient Tomb, and you can reasonably have that on the play, right? So you could beat a Days and maybe power through Force of Will or something. It's unlikely a 4 mana spell could do this, but I'm not a Legacy player, so I can't speak to it too much. The point is, the return on that 3 mana card has to be crazy for you to want to play it. Otherwise, you just never even consider playing it. So they have to make a card that's powerful enough at 3 mana that you would willingly throw into the most heinous disruption in the game, which is Force of Will, Days, and Wasteland. And it usually kind of balances out because the defenses in those formats are so good, right? And the card can be good but not dominant, which is what they want. They want a card that like could reasonably see constructed play and be a power player, but also not be a format defining card. Right? It can move the needle on what the format is, but it's not going to like take over the format. So they're going to make a card that does a lot for 3 mana. The problem is when you put that card in Vintage Cube, your defenses in Vintage Cube are nowhere near as good as they are in Constructed Legacy. So you can't play 4 Forces or 4 Dazes. You might get Force of Will, right? Which this has always been my position about taking Pyrokinesis or taking Fury or taking Solitude, is they are the Force of Wills of the format, and they are your best defensive cards. That's why I've always advocated for those cards, because they let you replicate play patterns of Legacy, but it just happens to be a Boros deck most of the time rather than an Izzet deck. But even in the most resilient Boros decks, it's still pretty. Your defenses aren't perfect, right? And they're not perfect in constructed either, so sometimes they get by. It's cool, but in an average draft, your defenses are like okay, right? You might be able to deal with one of them, but when they have 5 of them in their deck, the second one you might be able to answer, but the third one you probably can't. And they almost all end the game within 2 turns, or effectively establish an advantage that's so large in 2 turns that you're going to lose the game. So there's a kind of tension between wanting to design a card for constructed that's going to be quote unquote problematic for Vintage Cube. Yeah, correct. Your best answer is frequently play your own version of the card. So it just ends up in a kind of escalation of one-upmanship. It's just trading Flametongue Kavus, which a lot of legacy or lower-powered cubes I don't like to play because they're trading Flametongue Kavus back and forth. That's the whole gameplay. I don't find that fun. Because usually if you miss, you lose. If you can't answer the escalation, you lose the game. So like 2 years ago, Reanimator on turn 2 or 3, sometimes on turn 1 could reanimate their thing, and you'd have to like hope you have the thing. But they didn't really get it that often, right? They got it 30% of the time, and then like probably closer to 50 or 60 by turn 4. That they can consistently reanimate a creature by that point. Maybe higher, given number of tutors and things like that. But if you disrupted it, then you kind of succeeded, right? Because at that point, especially 2 years ago, before Atraxa and Atali, they might get Archon Cruelty, but that Archon, you beat the Archon, now you have to deal with Griselbrand, and Griselbrand's tough, but nowhere near as hard as the other cards. And after that, it was like Terastodon or something, which is just not a good card anymore. But now, people can tap 3 mana and get the same kind of return as they would setting up these combos. Now, that's a little bit hyperbolic, but not that hyperbolic. And so you just have these sequences of playing 3 and 4, and sometimes preceded by cards like Inti that make it so you just die. You're just dead. And I'm not like exaggerating. They do 20 damage. Like Gut does 14 damage in 2 turns. So, um, and like it was suggested in the chat, a lot of that's because the starting life total in Commander is 40. Right? And inconceivably, 120. That's how much damage you have to do to win through combat damage. So when you start to have the bleed over of those cards that are designed to break into Legacy to one degree or another, they end up dominating Vintage Cube. And if you look at all the cube lists that are around that are just like the quote unquote best cards, they're almost all based on either like reanimating Atraxa or Archon, which I don't find very interesting. I've always hated it. And then, or putting a Naya deck together that has a 2-3-4 curve that is unbeatable. And it doesn't matter what cards they are. It doesn't matter what they do. It's just they generate so much advantage in some way that you lose the game. So like, what does this deck do? Nothing. This deck doesn't do anything. It's just answers, Inflamed Tunkabus, and card draw. This is like the whole deck. This deck doesn't do anything. I don't know if I'm going to trophy it, but there's a pretty good chance. It's funny that even I could play like Resto Angel because it's good with some of my cards, but it's like, why? Just play another ridiculous card on its own. So you end up with a point where the density of the super broken cards is so high that the cards that synergize with them are not worth playing because you just play another broken card. Hey, no problem. I like to do it. Like I said, this is all hypothesis. This is just my personal analysis.